When I was a kid, one summer, we went to the Vologda region to stay with relatives, and the area there was swampy, the forests impenetrable. In general, a gloomy place. My relatives lived in a village on the edge of the forest. In fact, it was a dacha settlement. We arrived in the afternoon. It was overcast and raining. While we settled down, the adults started to kindle the brazier under the awning. The women fiddled in the kitchen, and I was the only child there, so I was bored. Toward evening, we ate kebabs, sat down as a merry group at the table. Adults drank vodka. The fog came from the marshes. It was often like that, there in summer. In between singing songs, relatives told stories about local people. One of them deserves special attention because it is directly related to what happened next. There was an old grandfather who lived in their tree. His old house was practically in the forest, and the grandfather was rarely seen. Well, if once every couple of years. The grandfather did not talk to anyone, wore the same clothes, and always avoided people. None of the locals knew how old he was. He seemed to be the oldest in the village. Among the oddities, in winter, there was never any smoke from his house. He had no relatives. In any case, nobody saw them. When grandfather appeared at the edge of the forest, he looked for a minute in the direction of the village, then turned around and went into the forest. His house was never lit from inside. So we sit, eat, have fun. The fog came down. It was like milk. It lasted for a couple of hours until it started to get dark. Then it slowly cleared. Someone came up with an idea. If the fog had cleared, we should take a picture of the whole crowd against the background of the forest. The places are beautiful after all. Before it finally got dark, we got together and took photos with the then fashionable Polaroid. I remember, on the developed picture, there were a lot of such small defects in the form of perfectly round balls, and they were mainly concentrated around the house of that grandfather. After that, the men went to bed. The women stayed to talk on the veranda and finish their wine, and I with them. They started gossiping about their relatives. Then they started talking about local people again, and remembered about that old man. I was looking at Polaroid pictures, and I came across a common picture. Children are very impressionable creatures. When I saw the old man's house surrounded by balloons in the background, I was frightened. And when in the next picture, I saw the old man himself in the distance, retreating into the forest with some bag, I felt that it was beyond my strength to look at it, all alone. I showed the pictures to my mother and sister, and they passed them around. They all agreed it was creepy. What happened next traumatized my psyche for the rest of my life. Late at night, we got ready for bed. We went to see off the neighbors. Their house stood between our house and the old man's house. We approached the house, hugs, goodbyes, and then we heard a strange rumble, as if we were standing in a big, long pipe, and there was wind outside, and from the opposite end of the pipe came such a characteristic sound. Can you imagine what I'm talking about? Except that we were standing on the street, and the hum was coming from the forest and spreading throughout the neighborhood. I began to slowly merge from fear. What happened next was more of the same. A new sound, like grunting, was added to the rumble. Damn, it still stands in my ears. It was coming from the direction of the old man's house. My sister and my godmother went home to get the men. My godmother was on the verge of a heart attack. The neighbors came out, also at the sound. Our men from the house came running. No one said a word. Everyone just stood there, listening to the sounds and succumbing to the seemingly gratuitous panic. My mother took my father and me by the hands. In the end, the whole group moved towards the hut in the forest. As we approached, we smelled a foul odor. The smell of metal, mixed with the smell of old or something. It was like the stench of decomposition. We approached the house. It was unclear whether anyone was in it or not. Everyone was terribly reluctant to knock on the door. Not only was the old man scary, but it was night, and those sounds. The door was unlocked. The neighbor came in first, followed by everyone else. The house was in a terrible shambles. It stank. We went into the living room or the dining room and was stunned by what we saw. There was a grandmother lying on the floor, on the head. Something like a muzzle, the grandmother herself, without legs and arms, apparently long ago amputated. She was making grunting sounds. We realized that her chest had been punctured. Nearby on the floor was a pin. This is the kind of pin used to pierce the heart of pigs when they are slaughtered. The women came to their senses and rushed to help. The sight was disgusting, with blood pouring from his pierced chest and sniffing sounds, mixed with grunting. My father turned me against the wall so I wouldn't have to look. The neighbor ran home to call an ambulance. The ambulance arrived about 40 minutes later, and the police came with them. The rumbling had stopped by then. Investigators later came to the conclusion that the grandmother had been locked up for 40 years, and that grandfather had slowly cut her. First thing he did was cut her vocal cords, so she couldn't scream. Hell knows how he stopped the bleeding and how Grandma survived. She ended up dying in the hospital. And nobody ever saw Grandpa from that day on. All that remains is his silhouette in a photograph in the evening, far away at the edge of the forest.